A mute little girl tries to order a hot chocolate for her billionaire father using the only language she knows. He thought it was cute, but what the waitress signed back will tear your heart out. What's the most surprising act of kindness you've ever witnessed? Let us know in the comments, and get ready for a story you won't forget. Julian Vance's world was built of glass and steel, a fortress of silence overlooking a city that roared with life he no longer felt. From his penthouse office on the 80th floor, he commanded Vance Tech, a global empire forged from code and ambition. He was an emperor of his own making, but his kingdom was cold, and he was its sole isolated inhabitant. His heart had been shuttered 6 years ago, the day a car accident had stolen his wife, Elena, and silenced his daughter, Maya. Maya, now 7, hadn't spoken a word since. She was his living shadow, a beautiful, fragile reminder of everything he had lost. Today was the anniversary. 6 years. The air in the penthouse was thick with unspoken grief. Instead of their usual sterile routine, a silent breakfast served by staff, Julian did something he hadn't done in years. He broke the pattern. "Come on, Peanut," he murmured, his voice rusty from disuse. "Let's go out." Maya looked up from her sketchbook, her enormous brown eyes, so much like her mother's, wide with surprise. She gave a small, hesitant nod. He bundled her into a coat over her simple dress and led her out of the gleaming, soulless building. They walked for blocks, a billionaire in a bespoke suit and a silent child in a plain wool coat, 2 ghosts haunting the vibrant city streets. They ended up in a small, unassuming cafe called The Daily Grind, a world away from Julian's usual 5-star haunts. It smelled of roasted coffee and warm bread, a scent so achingly normal it felt foreign. They took a small table by the window. A young woman with a kind, weary face and a messy bun approached them. "What can I get for you?" Julian opened his mouth to order, but Maya tugged on his sleeve. She looked at him, her expression serious, and then turned her small hands toward the waitress. With delicate, precise movements, she began to sign. It wasn't ASL. It was their secret language, a language of grief and love born in the silent years after the crash. A flutter of fingers for hot, a cupped hand for chocolate, and a gentle tap over her heart for please. Julian felt a familiar ache. It was their private world. He smiled sadly at the waitress, ready to translate. "She'd like a—" He stopped. His blood ran cold. The world tilted on its axis. The waitress wasn't looking at him. Her eyes were locked on Maya, a look of profound, earth-shattering recognition on her face. Her own hands, trembling slightly, rose from her sides. She mirrored Maya's signs perfectly, then added one of her own, a sign Julian hadn't seen in 6 years, a sign only one other person in the world had known. 2 fingers drawn from the corner of her eye like a tear, followed by a hand spread over her heart. "My little star." It was Elena's name for their daughter. Julian's breath hitched in his throat. The noise of the cafe, the city, everything faded into a deafening roar in his ears. It was impossible. A ghost had just spoken to his daughter. The waitress looked up, her gaze meeting his, and in her eyes he saw not just confusion, but a deep shared sorrow that she couldn't possibly understand. His carefully constructed reality shattered into a million pieces. The drive back to the penthouse was a blur. Julian's hands clenched the steering wheel of his Aston Martin, the knuckles white. His mind replayed the scene in the cafe, over and over. The girl's name was Clara, according to her name tag. She had been as stunned as he was, stammering an apology and rushing away after he'd thrown a $100 bill on the table and fled with Maya. Who was she? How could she know that sign? It wasn't just a sign. It was a memory, a piece of his soul. Elena had created it. She'd claimed Maya's eyes were so bright they were like tiny stars, and the sign had become their sacred lullaby, their secret promise. It died with her. It had to have. Back in his glass fortress, Julian stared out at the city lights, but saw nothing. Maya was in her room, sketching quietly, seemingly unaware of the earthquake that had just ripped through her father's world. He felt a desperate, clawing need for answers. This was not a coincidence. In his world there were no coincidences, only calculated moves and hidden motives. He buzzed his head of security, Marcus Thorne, a former Special Forces operative who was more of a confidant than an employee. "I need a full background check, now." "On who, sir?" Marcus's voice was calm, steady, a rock in Julian's churning sea of confusion. "A waitress. Her name is Clara. She works at the Daily Grind on Lexington." There was a brief pause. "Is there a threat?" "I don't know what it is," Julian said, his voice raw. "Find out everything. Where she was born, who her parents were, where she went to school, what she ate for breakfast. Everything, Marcus. I want to know everything." He hung up, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He felt like a man who had seen a phantom, and the experience had left him questioning the very foundation of his life. For 6 years he had accepted the narrative, a tragic accident, a beloved wife lost, a daughter traumatized into silence. He had buried his grief under a mountain of work, building an empire on the ashes of his happiness. Now a crack had appeared in that foundation. The next 2 days were torture. Julian went through the motions at Vance Tech, his mind a million miles away from the billion-dollar merger negotiations he was supposed to be leading. His sister, Veronica, the COO of his company and the only family he had left, watched him with narrowed eyes. "You seem distracted, Julian," she said, her voice smooth as silk as they stood in his office. "Something wrong?" Veronica was sharp, polished, and ruthlessly ambitious. She had been his rock after Elena's death, stepping in to manage the company while he was lost in his grief. He owed her everything, but he couldn't tell her about this. It felt too raw, too insane. "Just tired," he lied. "The anniversary." She placed a perfectly manicured hand on his arm, her expression softening into one of practiced sympathy. "I know it's hard, but Elena would want you to be strong for the company, for Maya." Her words felt hollow. He shrugged her hand away, a sudden, inexplicable feeling of irritation rising in him. On the 3rd day Marcus called. "I have the preliminary report, sir." "Tell me." Julian's voice was tight. "Clara Jenkins, 24 years old, grew up in the state foster care system, no criminal record. Lives in a walk-up in the Bronx. Her records are surprisingly thin. Sealed juvenile files, which is standard, but there's not much before that. It's like she appeared out of thin air at age 7. "Her parents," Julian demanded. "Mother deceased. Name was Elena Castillo. Father unknown." Julian froze. Elena. The name was a punch to the gut. It had to be a coincidence. It was a common name, but paired with the sign. "The mother," Julian said, his voice barely a whisper. "What did she do?" "She was a registered nurse, sir," Marcus said. "She worked at a few different hospitals, including St. Jude's General." The floor fell out from under Julian. St. Jude's General was where Elena had been taken after the accident. It was where she had been pronounced dead on arrival. His obsession was no longer just a feeling, it was a fire. He had to see Clara again. He had to know the truth. He canceled his afternoon meetings and drove, not to the cafe, but to the Bronx address Marcus had given him. He had to bypass the fortress she had clearly built around herself. He found her walking home, carrying a bag of groceries. She looked exhausted, the kindness in her face shadowed by a deep-seated weariness. He got out of the car, and her eyes widened in fear when she saw him. "Mr. Vance?" She clutched her grocery bag like a shield. "What are you doing here? Are you following me?" "I need to talk to you," he said, trying to keep his voice level, to not betray the storm raging inside him. "About the other day, the signs." Clara's face hardened. Her suspicion of him, of his wealth and power, was a tangible thing. "It was a mistake. I don't know how I knew it. Please, just leave me alone." She tried to push past him, but he stepped in her way. He was desperate. "I'll pay you for your time. Anything, please. It's important. It's about my wife." At the mention of his wife, her defensiveness wavered, replaced by a flicker of pained curiosity. She looked at the gleaming black car, at his expensive suit, and then into his eyes, and she must have seen something other than a billionaire throwing his weight around. She must have seen the raw desperation of a broken man. "My mother," she said softly, her voice trembling. "She's the one who taught me. She was a nurse. She told me it was a special language she learned from a patient who couldn't speak, a patient who died." Julian's world, which had already shattered, now dissolved into dust. A patient. His Elena. She hadn't been dead on arrival. She had been alive. She had been in that hospital, conscious enough to teach someone their secret language. He had been lied to. For 6 years, his life had been built on a devastating lie. Clara's apartment was small and cramped, but clean. The air was filled with the smell of old books and lemon-scented cleaner. It was a world of peeling paint and second-hand furniture, a stark contrast to the sterile luxury Julian inhabited. He felt like an intruder, a creature from another planet. He sat awkwardly on a worn armchair while Clara made tea, her movements tense. Maya was with her nanny, a fact for which Julian was suddenly grateful. This conversation was not for her innocent ears. "My mother passed away 6 years ago," Clara began, her voice low as she set a mug of tea on the cluttered coffee table. "It was sudden, an aneurysm. She didn't have much, but she left me a box. It was filled with her journals, old photos, and notebooks." She gestured to a worn cardboard box tucked into a corner. She was obsessed with this patient. She wrote about her all the time, about her bravery, her love for her daughter, and about the language. Mom practiced it constantly. She taught it to me. She said it was important to remember, that it was a promise. A promise. Julian's throat tightened. "Your mother, her name was Elena Castillo?" Clara nodded, her eyes welling with tears. "She was a good person, the best." "Did she ever talk about the patient's family? About her husband?" Julian asked, his voice strained. Clara shook her head. "No, she just called her the star-eyed woman. She said her family was powerful and that she had to be careful. After the patient died, my mom quit her job at the hospital. We moved not long after. She never spoke of it again, but I could tell it haunted her." A powerful family. He was a powerful family. But why would a nurse need to be careful? Why the secrecy? The official report was clear. Elena had succumbed to her injuries in the ambulance en route to the hospital. A clean, tragic, undeniable fact. Except it wasn't a fact at all. "I need to see those journals, Clara," Julian said, his voice imbued with an urgency that startled them both. "I know this is an intrusion, but I believe that patient was my wife." Clara stared at him, her suspicion warring with the dawning, horrifying truth in his eyes. Slowly she knelt and pulled the box from the corner. The air grew thick with the weight of the past as she lifted the lid. Inside were several spiral-bound notebooks, their pages filled with a neat, looping script. Julian reached for one with a trembling hand. He opened it to a random page. "She's so weak today, but she fought to stay conscious." She kept signing the same thing over and over, a name. Maya, and the sign for my little star. She made me promise to watch over her. How can I? Her family is a fortress. Her sister-in-law was here again. The look in that woman's eyes. It's like looking at a shark. Cold. Empty. She watches the monitors more than she watches the patient. Veronica. The name hit Julian like a physical blow. Veronica had been there. She had told him she'd arrived just as the doctors were calling the time of death. She had held him as he'd collapsed in the hospital corridor. She had been his pillar of strength. He read on, his hands shaking so badly the words swam before his eyes. The journals painted a horrifying picture. Elena, alive but paralyzed, unable to speak. Veronica, a constant, menacing presence, and a terrified nurse, caught in the middle of a drama she didn't understand. "There's one more thing," Clara whispered, her face pale. She reached into the box and pulled out a sealed, yellowed envelope. On the front, in the same neat script, was a single name, Julian. "My mother made me promise," Clara said, her voice choked with emotion. "She said if a man ever came asking about the star-eyed woman, I was to give him this. She said it was her confession." Julian took the envelope. His fingers felt numb. This was it, the truth he hadn't even known he was searching for. He tore it open, his heart pounding a violent tattoo against his chest. The letter was several pages long. It was a deathbed confession from a woman tormented by guilt. "Mr. Vance," it began, "if you are reading this, it means God has finally seen fit to bring you the truth I was too cowardly to deliver myself. Your wife, Elena, did not die when they said she did. She was alive for 3 days in my care. She was a fighter. But her spirit wasn't what failed her. It was her family. Your sister, Veronica, came to me on the 3rd night. She knew I was a single mother, that I was struggling. She offered me money, a life-changing amount, enough to secure my daughter's future forever. All I had to do was help your wife rest. She said it was a mercy, that Elena was in pain. She gave me a syringe. She told me to increase the morphine drip to falsify the records, to say her heart had finally given out. She said you were too fragile to handle a long, drawn-out goodbye. I did it. God forgive me, I took the money, and I did it. I silenced your wife. I let her die. The money is in a trust for my Clara. It's blood money, and it has been my damnation. I am a murderer, and your sister is a monster." The letter dropped from Julian's nerveless fingers. A guttural roar of pure animalistic rage tore from his throat. The grief he had suppressed for 6 years erupted, not as sorrow, but as a white-hot volcanic fury. He had not just lost his wife. She had been stolen from him, murdered. And the architect of his unending pain was the one person he had trusted completely, his own sister. The world wasn't just built on a lie, it was built on a grave. The revelation consumed him. Julian brought Clara and her mother's journals back to the penthouse. He needed her there, a living link to the truth. He set her up in a guest suite that was larger than her entire apartment, a gilded cage she accepted with wary reluctance. He explained to a confused Maya that Clara was a friend who would be staying with them. Maya, with the innocent wisdom of a child, simply took Clara's hand and led her to her playroom, accepting her presence without question. Julian, however, was a man possessed. He handed the confession letter to Marcus. "Verify it, every word. Find the money trail. I want a case so airtight that she can never escape it." While Marcus and his team of forensic accountants dug into Veronica's past, Julian's focus shifted. He was no longer just a CEO, he was an avenger. But as he plotted his sister's downfall, an unexpected complication arose. Clara. Her presence in his sterile home was like a wildflower blooming through concrete. She was quiet, unobtrusive, but her warmth began to seep into the cracks of his frozen heart. He watched her with Maya. She didn't push the child to speak. She simply entered Maya's silent world, communicating with the special language her mother had so guiltily preserved. For the first time in 6 years, Maya had someone who understood her completely. He saw his daughter laugh, a silent, shoulder-shaking laugh that was more beautiful than any sound he could imagine. A fragile hope began to dawn in him, a life beyond vengeance, a life that might actually include happiness. But the viper in his nest was not idle. Veronica, sensing the shift in Julian, the new presence in his life, grew suspicious. She couldn't know he had the truth, but she knew Clara was a threat to the status quo, to her carefully managed control over her brother's life. And so she struck. The first blow was a calculated media leak. A major gossip publication ran a front-page story. Billionaire Julian Vance's new love. Has the tech titan finally moved on from his tragic past? The article was accompanied by paparazzi photos of Julian and Clara entering his building. It was framed as a scandalous romance, painting Clara as a gold digger and Julian as a callous man moving on just weeks after the anniversary of his wife's death. The backlash was immediate. Vance Tech's stock dipped. The board of directors grew nervous. The carefully curated image of Julian as the grieving widower, wholly devoted to his company, was shattered. Julian was furious, but not for his own reputation. He was furious for what it did to Clara. He found her in the library, staring at the article on a tablet, her face ashen. "I'm so sorry, Clara," he said, his voice thick with anger. "This is my fault. This is my sister's doing." "I have to leave," she whispered, shaking her head. "I can't be here. I'm putting you and your daughter in danger." "No," Julian said, his voice firm. He walked over to her, his protective instincts roaring to life. "You're not going anywhere. This is exactly what she wants. She wants to isolate me again. We're going to fight this, together." In that moment, standing in the opulent library, he realized his mission had changed. It wasn't just about destroying Veronica anymore. It was about protecting the new, fragile world taking root in the ruins of his old one. It was about protecting Clara and Maya. Marcus called an hour later. "We've got it, sir. A shell corporation registered in the Cayman Islands. A single deposit of $5 million was made 6 years ago. It was funded through a series of offshore accounts that traced directly back to a private holding company owned by one person, Veronica Vance." The final nail was in the coffin. He had her. The rage returned, cold and sharp this time. He would not just expose her, he would obliterate her. He planned to confront her at the office the next day, armed with Marcus's evidence. He would have her arrested quietly, removed from his life and his company without a spectacle. But Veronica, sensing the walls closing in, was one step ahead. She had laid a more devastating trap. That morning, an emergency board meeting was called. Julian received the notification with a sense of dread. The agenda was a motion of no confidence in his leadership, citing his recent erratic behavior and the negative press. "It's a corporate coup," Marcus explained grimly over the phone. "She's been lining up proxy votes for years, waiting for a moment of weakness. The media leak was the catalyst she needed. She's making her move for the company." Julian's blood ran cold. She wasn't just trying to escape justice. She was trying to steal his entire empire, the legacy he had built. The meeting was in 2 hours. His presence was mandatory if he wanted to have any chance of fighting it. He was about to leave for Vance Tech Tower, his mind racing with strategy, when the doorbell to his penthouse rang. His butler answered it. 2 people stood in the doorway, a stern-looking woman and a police officer. "We're from the Administration for Children's Services," the woman said, flashing a badge. "We've received an anonymous report concerning the welfare of Maya Vance. We need to come in." It was a nightmare, a two-front war. Veronica was not just attacking his company, she was attacking his daughter. The anonymous tip, he knew with sickening certainty, had come from her. It would allege neglect, an unstable home environment, a strange woman living with them. It was a vicious, brilliant move. He looked at the clock on the wall. The board meeting started in 90 minutes. The social worker explained her investigation would take at least 2 hours. The choice was laid bare before him, stark and brutal. Go to the board meeting, fight for his company, his life's work, the billion-dollar empire he had built from nothing, save his legacy. Or stay. Stay here with his daughter, protect her from the bureaucratic machine Veronica had sicked on them, prove that he was the father she needed him to be. For a moment, the old Julian, the isolated emperor, wrestled with the decision. The company was everything. It was his shield, his identity. Losing it would be like losing a part of himself. Then he looked past the social worker and saw Maya standing in the hallway, her small hand clutching Clara's. Her eyes, her mother's eyes, were wide with fear. She wasn't looking at the strangers. She was looking at him, her silent gaze asking a single heart-wrenching question. "Are you going to leave me too?" In that instant, the empire turned to dust. The money, the power, the legacy. It was all meaningless. Glass and steel, nothing more. He turned to his assistant, who was waiting by the door with his briefcase. "Call the board," Julian said, his voice clear and steady, filled with a certainty he hadn't felt in years. "Tell them I will not be attending." He then turned to the social worker, his posture no longer that of a titan of industry, but simply a father. "Please come in," he said calmly. "My daughter is the only thing that matters." It was the ultimate sacrifice, his public choice. He was letting his kingdom fall to protect the one small, precious person who was his entire world. He walked past them, knelt before Maya, and gently took her face in his hands. "I'm right here, Peanut," he whispered. "I'm not going anywhere." As the social worker began her questioning, Julian felt a strange sense of peace settle over him. He had made his choice. He had chosen his family. Whatever came next, he would face it as a father, not an emperor. But he had made one last move before the social worker arrived. He had given Marcus a final order. If he chose his daughter over his company, Marcus was to enact the scorched earth protocol. He was to release everything, the nurse's confession, the financial records, the whole sordid story, to every major news outlet in the world, time to go live the exact moment the board meeting began. Veronica wanted an empire. He would make sure she inherited nothing but ashes. Porn. The penthouse, once a symbol of Julian's isolation, became a sanctuary. The social worker, Ms. Albright, was thorough and professional, her questions probing. But Julian answered each one with a calm, unwavering honesty. He spoke of his grief, of his daughter's silence, of the profound guilt he felt for having been an emotionally absent father. He spoke of Clara not as a new lover, but as a link to his wife's final days, a woman who had brought understanding and light back into his daughter's world. Clara spoke too, her voice quiet but firm, explaining how she had come to be there. She showed Miss Albright her mother's journals, letting the words of a woman long dead speak to the truth of their situation. But the most powerful testimony came from Maya herself. She couldn't speak, but she didn't need to. She sat beside her father, her small hand tucked firmly in his. At one point she retrieved her sketchbook and showed Ms. Albright a drawing. It was of 3 people holding hands under a brightly shining sun, a man, a woman, and a little girl. It was a picture of a family, a picture of hope. As the interview was winding down, Julian's phone, which he had placed on the table, began to buzz incessantly. News alerts, texts from panicked board members. He ignored them all. They were echoes from a world he had already left behind. In the Vance Tech boardroom, 40 blocks away, Veronica Vance stood at the head of the long mahogany table, a triumphant smile on her face. Julian's chair was empty. His absence was a concession. Victory was hers. As Mr. Vance has chosen to abdicate his responsibilities, she began, her voice ringing with false regret. The board has little choice but to vote in favor of the motion. Her speech was cut short by the sudden vibration of every phone in the room. A board member gasped, his face paling, as he read the headline that had just flashed across his screen. Vancetech CEO Veronica Vance implicated in murder-for-hire plot. Shocking confession letter of deceased nurse reveals Elena Vance's death was a homicide. The room erupted. Veronica's smile froze, cracking like porcelain. Her eyes darted to the doors just as they swung open. It wasn't Julian. It was two uniformed police detectives. "Veronica Vance," one of them said, his voice cutting through the chaos, "you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder." The click of the handcuffs was the only sound in the suddenly silent room. The empire she had killed for had crumbled in her hands at the moment of her coronation. She was led away, her face a mask of disbelief and pure, unadulterated hatred. Her kingdom had lasted less than a minute. Back at the penthouse, Miss Albright closed her notebook. She looked at Julian, at Clara, and at the little girl nestled safely in her father's arms. "I think I have everything I need," she said, a hint of a smile touching her lips. "My report will reflect that Maya is in a safe and loving home. There's nothing to worry about." Lie. As she left, Julian felt the last 6 years of tension drain from his body. It was over, all of it. He looked at Clara, and his eyes conveyed a gratitude so profound. Words were unnecessary. He had sacrificed his empire, and in doing so, he had saved everything that truly mattered. 3 months later, the autumn chill had given way to the crisp promise of winter. The scandal had rocked the financial world, but Vance Tech, under new loyal leadership hand-picked by Julian, had weathered the storm. Julian had stepped back from the CEO role, taking a position as chairman. His focus was no longer on quarterly earnings reports, but on sidewalk chalk drawings and bedtime stories. He, Clara, and Maya were in Central Park. The leaves were a riot of gold and crimson. Maya, bundled in a red coat, was chasing fallen leaves, her movements light and joyful. Julian watched her, a genuine smile gracing his features for the first time in what felt like a lifetime. Clara stood beside him, her hand resting comfortably on his arm. She had become an indispensable part of their lives, a bridge between a painful past and a hopeful future. "Look at her," Julian murmured, his voice thick with emotion. "I almost lost this. I almost chose a building full of computers over her." "You chose her when it mattered," Clara said softly. "That's all she'll ever remember." Maya stopped chasing leaves and ran toward them, her cheeks flushed with cold. She held up a perfect star-shaped maple leaf, her eyes shining. She looked from the leaf to Julian, her small face serious. She took a deep breath, her little chest puffing out. Then, a sound. A small, miraculous sound he had longed to hear for 6 long years. "Daddy," she said, her voice a clear, sweet whisper. Julian's heart stopped. The world fell away. There was only the sound of his daughter's voice, a key turning in a lock he thought was rusted shut forever. Tears streamed down his face as he swept her up into a hug, burying his face in her hair. He held her tight, the most precious treasure in his new kingdom, a kingdom built not of glass and steel, but of love, resilience, and the unshakable bond of family. He looked over Maya's shoulder at Clara, whose own eyes were shining with tears, and he knew, with absolute certainty, that he was finally truly home.